So here is some nuts. I had to walk a long way. Maybe I was. You said you wanted some nuts.
I expected you guys
Hello.
So, you mind what order?
Can't hear you.
I'm not talking to you yet.
That's on purpose.
We'll start with you. Everything.
All right. Oh no. Okay. All right. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming. It seems really loud now. Does it sound really loud? Is it okay from there? All right. All right. It's kind of it's right in our ears a bit. Okay. So thanks for coming everyone for this week's seminar. Well, I'm Jeremy, but I think most people know that. This is we've got Sara Banet-Weiser and Sara Farris with us today. Going to be talking about their books and a whole range of connected issues to do with feminism and its relationship to various other political aspects of the present moment. So we're going to use the same format we used a couple of weeks ago. I'm just going to ask them some questions, each of them some questions about the book that they can respond to, and we'll take it from there. So Sara is a professor at the LSE, the London School of Economics. Her book is called Empowered: Popular Feminism and Popular Misogyny. So I should have rigged up a slide so you can see the cover. It's a really cool cover. They both got good covers. So we can ask about that. So just, this is always the Viva question, isn't it? What's it about? I did have someone once walk out of a Viva, and I just said, "Can you just tell us in your own terms what your thesis was about?" So, that was. So, he told everyone I'd intimidated him. He went around and told everyone.
What, you?
Me. Sorry, this has nothing to do with the topic. Okay. So Sara, maybe you can tell us. Okay, yeah. What's the book about, roughly?
The book is about. It kind of started with me noticing. I've been a feminist media. Is this you can hear me?
Yeah.
It is a weird feedback. Yeah, you're right. A feminist media scholar for all my career, and I started noticing, like many other people in Europe and North America, about 5 or 6 years ago, the presence and visibility of a certain kind of feminist message that began to be circulated on social media in particular, but in films and televisions and pop songs, in award speeches, and Beyonce singing at the VMAs in 2014 with the word feminist behind her. And so I started thinking, so I initially started the book thinking about what this meant. What does it mean to have this very highly visible, very sort of commodified message and practice of feminism that circulated all over the place? And I felt very ambivalent about this because in one sense, as someone who has been a feminist her whole career, it was super exhilarating to see young women, especially my students and other young women, embrace feminism in a way that I hadn't seen before. But every time I began to investigate one of these feminist messages, whether or not it's a Tumblr page dedicated to like body positivity, or Beyonce and the word feminist behind her, or, you know, aspirational feminist messages like you go, or, you know, you're beautiful, you're confident. Every single time that I began to investigate one of those messages, I found an increasingly hostile and increasingly visible rejoinder or response to these, whether or not that's, you know, slut-shaming or body-shaming comments on body positivity sites, or rape and death threats on online sites, or, you know, men's rights organizations saying that feminism is a cancer, this is the problem, and everything else. So the book is about that relationship between what I called popular feminism and popular misogyny. And what I argue in the book is that the themes of popular feminism, things like confidence or self-esteem or technical competence, are sort of appropriated by popular misogyny or different men's rights organizations in a kind of mirroring way. But that mirror is like a funhouse mirror where those themes of confidence and competence are turned on their head, and the politics behind them are sort of reallocated so that women, and feminists in particular, become the perpetrators and men become the victims of feminism. So men lose confidence because women have gained it. Men, you know, are threatened by women entering into technology because that is their realm. And so the book is about those themes and that relationship. And I'm arguing that I don't think that we can talk about popular feminism without talking also about misogyny and the misogynistic responses to it as a relationship.
Okay, great. That's a really great summary for a really important argument. So, I mean, one thing I suppose I would just like invite you to clarify, Sally. What do you mean by popular feminism? People define the popular in lots of different ways. For me, at least in this project, I defined it along kind of three different interrelated sort of lines. One is the popular for me means like a broad accessibility, so that the reach of digital media and social media is much greater than we've seen in feminist, you know, kind of feminist messages before. So you know, you can see, you can access feminism, and it has a reach that's popular in that sense. I also think that it's about popularity in the sense that it is about a particular kind of feminism. There's lots of feminisms that circulate in social media, but really a particular version becomes most prominent and most visible, and that's the one that addresses women as consumers, as individuals. It's a highly commodifiable feminism. It is, by and large, a white feminism, and so I wanted to look at what that meant to have one version of feminism kind of become very visible, and how that eclipsed others into the shadows, and that kind of like navigating popularity there. And third, for me, popular has always been, my work has always been informed by the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who argued that the popular is a terrain of struggle, where there's competing demands for power and for dominance. And so I was looking at the broad kind of landscape of popular feminism as that terrain of struggle, to see which kind of versions become more prominent. Who did you, Stuart Hall, did you say?
Stuart.
I'll have to look him up. Yeah, I know, I don't know. Sounds interesting.
You should look him up.
So yeah, I mean that's really interesting. It's interesting to me. So I was really, you know, the question of what a popular feminism would look like was always to me seemed like a really, in the 90s. I remember thinking this is a really important question, like what would popular feminism. I mean, one question I wanted to ask, just so before we go deeper, actually, is to what extent do you think the shift that occurred in sort of public discourse around feminism was it indexed a real change in attitude? So, and to what extent was it just a change in terminology? Because, I mean, I had this stick I used to do with students for like years, and like for decades, where I'd say, who here is a feminist? And like one person put their hand up, and I'd say, okay, so which of these statements do you not agree with? Like, women have been systematically subordinated in every culture we know of. That's a bad thing. We should do something about it. And they'd all say, no, we all agree with those statements. And I said, well, then you're a feminist. And then and I'm not sure, it's a question I don't really know whether the distribution of opinions around those issues actually shifted, or whether it's a terminology. And then, I mean, my own reading of the situation, I sort of did that for a long time, and I kept saying to them, you know, for years I've just assumed that you are feminist. And then eventually I thought, no, that's quite banal, actually. They mean something. They say they're not feminist. And what they mean is they don't feel any kind of personal identification with the politics and history of the women's movement. And yet they are committed to a set of normative principles that we would call liberal, you know, sort of liberal feminism. And so I suppose then in that context, then I'm asking what you think about, did the kind of re-valorisation, the public valorisation of the term, did it index a change in attitudes, or just a historical shift, or a real, or, you know, what?
Yeah, I think it's all of those things. I mean, I think that you know, about 5 or 6 years ago, we could kind of witness a particular conjuncture that I think you know, authorized this highly visible feminism to emerge in the way it did. And to, you know, my corollary to your story is I teach a class called Gender and Media, and I have for 20 years, and you can see the trajectory of my students and how they are affiliated and attached to feminism, how it has shifted over the years. So you know, that moment when one person in the class raises their hand when if you ask them if they're a feminist, to a moment where my students are forming feminist activist groups, you know, kind of really organizing on campus for different gender issues on campus. So looking at that trajectory, I started thinking about what was it that kind of authorized it. And I think it's a couple of things. One is that, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was seen to be, at least it was widely reported in North America and Europe, a crisis in girls. And it was a crisis in STEM fields. They weren't going into STEM fields. It was a crisis in self-esteem. There was cyberbullying, what was called at that time. There was body image issues, eating disorders. People wrote books about how to raise girls in this era. And one of the things that I think is important to note about that is that this becomes a crisis when white middle-class girls are in crisis, right? So when they're seen as a problem for white middle-class girls, it becomes a national and global crisis. And so I think that part of what popular feminism emerges as is in response to that crisis. Turns out that post-feminism and the whole conceit that we no longer need feminism, that it's done its job and everything's fine, is actually not true, as we, you know, see more and more statistics and everything else. So I think it responds to that in part. I also think it responds to an increasing visibility of misogyny. And that is doesn't just emerge like from some dark hole, but it also is related to economics. In economic context, so the global economic global collapse of 2007, 2008 meant that many people lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods, went to austerity, went to these movements where class and class discrimination became very acute. And so in that sense, many men, not all men obviously, rather than blame the banks or greed, or capitalism, or patriarchy for any of this, the kind of shift of the blame sort of turned to women. And so I think that that's one of the ways in which misogyny emerges, and popular feminism responds to that as well. So there's a bunch of different forces, I think, that authorize it.
That's really useful analysis, I think. I mean, I suppose I'd ask, it seems another factor might be as well that, I mean, you can tell me what you think about this, but I mean, like Angela McRobbie's account of the kind of late post-feminist moment, so pre-2008, is that, you know, young women in particular are offered this very specific kind of, you know, deal within that sort of social settlement, what she calls the new sexual contract, and it's very much dependent upon, it basically means they get to have jobs like that better than their mums did, and they get to go out to work, and they get to sort of participate in public culture in a certain way, but they're expected to maintain very, very narrowly defined forms of self-presentation, sort of highly sexualized, and really it's all oriented around consumption. And the thing, I mean, this was really actually, I mean, my experience is, I've told this story lots of times actually, probably in this seminar I've told it before, but like teaching that text, teaching that book was that when it had just come out, it just came out around 2008, and sort of girls loved it. They thought, yeah, that's exactly what my life is like. And then within a couple of years, that moment was over, at least for my students, and it was over because basically basically the media and publishing industries were not, and the retail and finance sectors were not offering those young women the thing that they had been being offered in order to go along with all that. Yeah, they were not being offered the jobs now. You know, if they wore the short skirts and the makeup and the Jennifer Aniston hair, it wasn't going to get them the jobs they'd been promised. So they stopped doing it. So that seems. Do you think that's part of it as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you know, in Angela's account, when she was talking about these promises of not just post-feminism but also just kind of neoliberal capitalism, if you know, this kind of it was you know what Joe Littler has called you know this merit, you know, the kind of myth of meritocracy. If that was true, why aren't there more female CEOs, right? If it's about economics, why? If it's about leaning in, how come there's still like only 5% of all the CEOs in the entire world are women? You know, post-feminism can't answer those questions, and they can't fulfill the promises, like you said, that they posed for women and girls. So yeah, I do think that that's part of it. If women are sexual subjects rather than sexual objects, which is what post-feminism also says, that we're, you know, in control of our sexual subjectivity, why do we then have, you know, rampant rape culture? Why do we have Me Too? Right? Why do we have widespread sexual harassment across all industries if all those promises, again, that post-feminism you know, offered us, if they actually were fulfilled? So I do think that people kind of looked around and thought, well, you know, I wear the shirt that says porn star and it doesn't help me, you know? So now I'm going to wear the shirt that says this is what a feminist looks like. I'm going to argue that doesn't really help either, but that is a shift in t-shirt, right? I mean, it's a shift in the sentiment that we wear on our t-shirts. And so I do think that that trajectory was super interesting to me to kind of trace and to try to figure out what was motivating it and what was mobilizing what I saw as like a new kind of movement.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, you've just suggested that wearing a T-shirt that says "This is what a feminist looks like" doesn't help. I don't. My sister gave me one of those T-shirts, like it's very proudly, and I don't wear it because it seems a bit gauche. I feel bad about not wearing it. But maybe you could say a bit more about what then are the limits of this popular feminism, and like what does it curtail? What are its limits, and what are possible alternatives?
Yeah, I have to say I'm a little bit mad that you didn't wear it for this seminar. I mean, this would have been the perfect one, right, for him to wear. Yeah. Yes, I also have that T-shirt. I didn't wear mine either, so I'm with you. But first of all, I do have these T-shirts, and I have all the stuff. You know, I have like "fuck the patriarchy" stickers in my office, and the pins and the mugs that I drink coffee out of every day. I don't have any issue with the commodities per se. How I see them in this particular moment, though, is that because of the way in which social media and digital media has such a broad reach and accessibility, that the visibility of those kinds of commodities becomes an end in itself often. So you can wear the T-shirt and it's an announcement of your politics, rather than wearing the T-shirt as a route to something else. And this is just one version of feminism, right? There's lots of different versions, but I think that because the most visible feminism, at least in this media landscape, is one that targets women as individuals, it doesn't target feminism as a collective politics. It is something that is about commodifying feminism in a particular way. It is about companies like Dove and Audi and Chevy harnessing their products to feminism, and so vacating feminism of its politics when it does it. So I think that the T-shirt becomes the politics itself, and that's the problem. Not that the political intention of someone wearing the T-shirt isn't the problem. It's the fact that visibility becomes an end in itself rather than a route to something else like social change.
All right, yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah. I was thinking I probably would have worn the T-shirt that said I was a feminist before it was cool. Like, that probably has something to do with my reluctance. I was thinking when you were saying about that. So, I mean, it seems really important, this idea of like feminism as a collective project. So what you're drawing attention to is, I think, to the fact that this particular mode of neoliberal feminism it really doesn't address the idea. I mean, it's not really grounded in the idea of women's liberation as a collective project. It's grounded in it's not really even a sort of. I mean, there's an interesting question, isn't there, as whether it is a sort of movement. I think it's not. It's not really a movement politics. It's something else. I was actually just this afternoon. I was interviewing Mika Nava about her experiences in the women's liberation movement and kind of consciousness raising groups in the early 70s for the ACFM podcast. So look out for that. So I think maybe you could say a bit more then about how in that context then the specific. I mean, the book is called Empowered, and this concept of empowerment has a very interesting trajectory that does indeed go back to the moment of women's liberation, and then is still sort of carried on today. So maybe you can say a little bit about that and about why the book is called that.
Sure. I think the concept of empowerment actually has a very interesting relationship to the concept of liberation. Liberation, especially in a different kind of moment of feminist politics, it had its limitations too, right? But it was actually, if you think about the word liberation, it is to liberate oneself or a collective or a community from something, right? Empowered, I think in the current moment especially, it's become such a buzzword, and there's never an ending clause to it. Empowering, what are we empowering people to do? So it's just empowered. I'm empowered. You just wear a shirt that says empower, or empowered, and it doesn't have a specificity to it, not a historical specificity or a political specificity. And so that's the title of the book is a play on that, right? Is like, again, and what does empowered mean in this particular moment? What are we empowering women to do? What are we empowering men to do? How is empowerment then appropriated by misogyny as a way to, again, reallocate sort of suffering and victimhood to particular men and men's groups? So I think empowerment is the buzzword in development projects. It is the buzzword in neoliberal feminism. It is the buzzword in corporations where you have big signs that say empower yourself. And I feel like it is one of those neoliberal terms that actually means maybe empower yourself to become a better economic subject, but it doesn't mean empower yourself to become a better feminist subject.
Okay, I mean, that's really interesting. So you're saying, the point that it being there's no qualifying, clause. It's just empowered. Of course, I think what you're drawing out is that the implication is actually it's extremely normative. There's only one thing you could ever be empowered to be or want to be empowered to be. And that's basically a successful consumer. Someone who earns enough to consume and gets to consume a lot. That is the only, and that is what it's fundamental to neoliberalism. As a project, really, is to convince us that in fact, I would say that extends to all of neoliberalism, not just neoliberal feminism, that the consumer is the only type of agent. The consumer is consumption is the only mode of agency. And if you don't critique that, then you've got a problem. But I suppose, a question then, and this is sort of heading towards talking about some of the things in Sara's book, but we'll stay with this for a minute, is, what do we make of these men? Men engaging in sort of in these forms of misogyny. I'm always reminded actually of like last year, in the series last year, we had Mandy Merck do a talk, and Mandy taught me in a seminar at Sussex 25 years ago or something, and even then I remember her saying, this was the heady days of queer theory, people. Judith Butler's sort of second book had just come out, so it was still cool to be into Judith Butler, and that was And Mandy taught a whole seminar like based on bodies that matter. And she was talking about this, the classic theory of the exchange of women, the classic theory that patriarchy, the sort of feminist anthropological theory that patriarchy is always based on a system, a fundamental idea that different families, different clans exchange women as kind of tokens and to avoid incest, but women are objects which are exchanged. And she's talking about the kind of traditional sexual contract within which men, straight men, are expected to fulfill various kind of social responsibilities, live up to certain kinds of roles, and in return for that, what they get is, they get a guarantee of a sexual partner, etc. And she said, and this is Mandy's sort of, it was quite, it was a very surprising thing to hear in that kind of context. But he said, well, she says, I think given that, this is breaking down, it's breaking down because of feminism, so I wonder how men are going to react, because it seems to me there are lots of men who are no longer getting that contract, they're no longer getting that, and it's not clear what they are actually being given instead. Like, what are they going to get? What are they going to get in return for no longer, having lost their position as the kind of traditional patriarch? And she said, I think there's going to be a huge backlash against this at some point, if without some kind of radical discourse which can kind of incorporate them. And it seemed quite prophetic. And I suppose one of the questions then is, well, what do we say about the fact that, well, in certain senses, certain categories of men, they sort of have lost something. They have lost something and haven't really been given anything back. Is that right? Is it just wrong to say that, or is it, and what do we say about it?
Yeah, that's a great question that I've been thinking about a lot lately. First of all, though, I think that next time you should wear the T-shirt that says "I was into Judith Butler when it was cool," alongside the feminist. I'm still into her, by the way, so I'm obviously not cool. I think that. First of all, I think that what you're saying about, first of all, anytime feminism is in sort of the air like it is right now, it's going to be perceived as a threat. And I think that what we're witnessing right now is a context of increasingly violent responses to that threat and what it might mean or what it is imagined to mean. And I think, the structure of that is exactly what you just said, which is, and I'm working on an article right now with Jack Bradich, who's here, about the ways in which neoliberalism fails to manage its failures. How the promises of neoliberalism, when they go unfulfilled, there is no network of support, there is no network of care, and people from the CARE Collective are here too tonight that are looking at things like this. There is no support system. When all those promises, including that you can, a heterosexual man can sleep with any woman he wants as long as he just follows the rules, or learns the game, or practices the right techniques. And so when that doesn't happen, where do we go? And I think that one of the things is that we can see this in the economic collapse of 2007, 2008. Neoliberalism failed to live up to its promises then too. And what was left was actually real injury, right? Again, austerity, poverty, loss of livelihood, loss of jobs, loss of homes, everything, And so that is actually a real injury. But again, the blame for that is not about patriarchy. When patriarchy, if you think about the way in which competitive capitalism works, is a part of a patriarchal function, that could be a good place for us to think about and interrogate and struggle over. But instead of focusing on patriarchy, people, some of these men who I would say, Mandy, I agree with Mandy, absolutely, but I do think that now we're also witnessing a radical organizing of these groups. In the last 2 or 3 years, there's been 5 mass killings in the United States that have been claimed by incels, claimed by men who have been sexually rejected by women, and so feel like this is the only recourse they have, is to turn their violence in mainly against women. And so I do think that has, that again, there's a lot of different factors here, and instead of kind of recognizing some of the structural forces behind the injury of capitalism, the focus has been more and more on targeting women, as you know, and saying that feminism in particular is the perpetrator here. It's because of feminism that this happens, and because of feminism that men are injured. And so trying to kind of parse that out and figure out where we are now in this particular moment has been, I don't have the answer, but I think that that is the direction that we should be looking in.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, I think, I mean, if people don't know it, the ContraPoints series of YouTube videos. ContraPoints is an American kind of a person who produces trans woman who produces really interesting videos. One of the most interesting is a kind of response to Jordan Peterson, and then one about, I think the most affecting one she's done is about incels, and the kind of sympathy she tries to elicit for incels. And she says, well, the incel culture does represent like a real trauma which people are undergoing, and it's a very, very sort of interesting video, I think. I suppose, I mean, there's a question there then about, I mean, seems to me there's a question about where, you know, sort of, what either popular feminism or kind of, you know, politicized, you know, feminism now, like what, I mean, how does it, and how it addresses masculinity? Because I suppose, I'm remembering now when I used the phrase, but I used the phrase popular feminism in something I wrote, like I don't remember where it was now, like in the 90s, and said, well, ultimately we need a popular feminism which can also speak to men, which can speak to straight men and give them some sense of like how they're supposed to respond to the demands of feminism and what it would mean to do so constructively. And I wonder if you think, is it right that that's an issue, and is it there? Is there something that, are there resources there that we can draw on, or is it an absence? Because I'm not sure. It's not a rhetorical question.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a fully formed answer to that non-rhetorical question, but I think, you know, I think I'm right behind the speakers. Yeah, so right there. So a student asked me the other day if I would like to see an unpopular feminism, and I actually thought it was a really super good question and made me think a lot, like, what does it mean? Again, I feel ambivalent about this popular feminism. It's bolstering and exhilarating to have people embrace it, and not you know, do that kind of I'm not a feminist but thing. But at the same time, for the reasons why I've talked about it, I'm also ambivalent about it in the way it addresses women as consumers and as individuals. So the popular, the kind of heightened public awareness is important, but it may be the first step. But this popular feminism is cheery, it's happy, it's affirmative. It is, you know, look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself you're beautiful. Just be confident about this, you know, again, lean in, this kind of stuff. I think that what we need is an angry feminism. And I would love it, to your question, I would love that to be an inclusive kind of feminism, but angry women are also threatening in all sorts of ways, and challenging patriarchy is sort of an alienating move, right? Because it forms the groundwork for so many lives and so many identities and self-affirmation and self-identification, and so I think we need to get to a point where anger and rage, and we're starting to. I mean, there's lots of stuff about rage, and
but
you know,
the Nike ad with the women, that was also already taken into the max consumerist level. I mean,
the one about the crazy women, the crazy ad, yeah. I mean, and I feel ambivalent about that Nike ad. This is a Nike ad that just came out about women being angry, but it's harnessed to a product, and it is a very highly produced ad that gives, you know, makes me feel really great about that moment. But whether or not it continues, how we can figure out how to move anger into something structural, anger into something that is collective rather than consumers, that's the trick, right? And that is not just women only. Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the language that it spreads around, and I think this is, you know, the articulation of an ad for all of us is, let's say, somehow a benefit. You know.
Yeah, that's the kind of intention of the ad, you mean?
No, it's not. the intention of the ad is to sell Nike, but for the rest of us, it's a language, it's an articulation. It summarizes it shortly, no?
Yeah, but if it just stays there, then it's just an articulation, right? And that's the next step. And I'm not sure how to get to the next step. But I do think that we can't get through it through ads. And so I think that's the first step is using the language, but then figuring out how to use that language to mobilize collective politics rather than individuals is the trick, right? Anyway, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's really helpful. I suppose I think this has been the last thing, just to sort of follow up that. Then, I mean, the idea of a collectively angry feminism seems really potent, and I wonder what you think about to what extent do you think sort of men as well can be recruited into sort of sharing that anger? The hypothesis, the suggestion I would make is that, Jordan Peterson is really fascinating because almost everything, Jordan Peterson, his success is basically based on responding to a set of, symptoms which are shared mainly by young men, a set of pathologies shared by young men, and almost all of them are actually caused by, they're caused by patriarchy. That's the cause of them. And it's quite easy. It's quite easy to make that discourse. Say, actually, everything he's talking about is true, but it's patriarchy. Those men should be angry at patriarchy. And he's saying, don't be angry at patriarchy. Be angry at women. Be angry at communists. Like Canadian university lecturers. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I mean about this kind of reallocation of victimhood from those who are in positions of power and privilege, like Jordan Peterson, to those who have historically suffered and been denied agency and rights and livelihoods. And so I do think that is right. Yes. Do I think that the angry collective feminist subject or community should be inclusive of men? To your question, absolutely. I think that. It's very difficult, again, not for every man, but it's very difficult for men to kind of embrace the angry woman. And you can see this historically, you can see it especially in women of color, where there's a whole other history there. So I think once anger is embraced as a politics and not as an alienating factor, that's where we can, and Peterson is not going to help us there, right? Because he says things that really resonate. Tidy up, stand up straight, put your shoulders back. All these kinds of things that feel very comforting and mundane, and someone's taking care of me. And then he laments the fate of the young white male in North America as being the key kind of, moment of suffering in the current moment. And but prefacing it with tidy up really works as a strategy, and so I think that that we have to sort of struggle against historical stereotypes about anger if we're going to actually form this kind of angry collective, because then we can mobilize rage into something that actually agitates for something other than just individuals.
All right, fantastic. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm gonna move on and ask Sara a question. I think you could give Sara a clap for that. The problem with the little interview format is you don't get the natural sort of punctuation. No, we're going to do you first, then we'll have general Q&A. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we will. Yeah, there'll be plenty. Don't you worry about that.
No, I'm not worried.
Sorry. Okay. So Sara's book, In the Name of Women's Rights, the Rise of Femo-Nationalism. So I think, obviously the first thing we have to ask is, what is Femo-Nationalism?
Okay, so you didn't ask me what's the book about.
I'm going to do that next.
It's fine. So Femo-Nationalism is this term I use, obviously, maybe some of you will know, I guess, here, the word homo-nationalism, which Jasbir Puar introduced to describe this collusion between certain LGBTQ movements in the United States and nationalism, American nationalism, particularly the idea of portraying Muslims as homophobic. So I was inspired by this work and also this term, I thought it was quite effective in synthetically describing what was going on, also this very perplexing situation. And so femonationalism describes the instrumentalization of feminism and women's rights, particularly by nationalists, but also by neoliberals, and as I write, also by some feminists, in anti-immigration and anti-Islam campaigns. So in this book, so maybe I'll go also straight at saying what's the book about. I look at 3 different countries. I'm from Italy, as you might have understood. So I look at Italy, France, and the Netherlands. And in these countries, I look at the ways in which right-wing nationalist parties in these countries have used increasingly ideas of women's rights when they claim they are defending women. But whenever they do that, it's always in the context of saying that migrants, particularly migrant men, and in the present conjuncture, Muslim men are a threat for European societies because they are presented especially as sexual predators, as oppressors of women. And so I look, first of all, at the ways in which these parties, these nationalist parties, are mobilizing these ideas of women's rights against migrants and Muslims. I always underline, I always want to stress that it's not just Muslim, but it's also migrants more generally. And I look obviously at the contradictions, because these parties are certainly not feminist parties. So the ways in which they instrumentalize feminism is totally hypocritical, and it's done precisely for electoral political purposes and for racist purposes. But I also look at actors such as feminists, who have also, some feminists, obviously not all feminists in these countries, who have also increasingly used ideas of women's rights against Islam. So for these feminists, the idea is, yes, we are not nationalists, we are not racist, but we have to, we actually have to accept, and we have to say that there is a specific problem with Islam, that Islam is a specifically patriarchal religion, more patriarchal and more oppressive than other religions. Therefore, we need to defend women, and we need to, Muslim women, and we need to help them to emancipate. So my book questions all of this, and in particular, I try to explain also the economic foundation of all of these claims. I mean, at the end of the day, this is really the contribution, I suppose, of my book. There has been lots of work on the contradictions of many of these feminists, in terms of how they assume a kind of paternalistic stance towards Muslim women. There has been lots of work on the ways in which these parties are instrumentalizing in hypocritical ways women's rights, but I think there has not been much about the ways in which all of this also has an economic foundation. And what I try to say is that when we look at the types of emancipation that these nationalist parties or these feminists propose to these women as ways of emancipation, what we see is that actually these women are increasingly asked to become the nannies, the babysitters, the cleaners of these European countries. So it's a huge contradiction for feminists, clearly, because they are asking these Muslim women to do something they don't want to do, and that the feminist movement fought against, particularly in the 1970s, but obviously also now. And also I think it's important to show the ways in which these nationalist parties themselves are in a way showing what scholars call the racialization of sexism, which means that also racism needs to be understood in the different ways in which it applies to men and women. So for the racist and the nationalists, when they say, yes, we need to emancipate these women, or we need to rescue these Muslim women from men, it doesn't mean that they are not racist against these women. It just means they are, if you want, racist in a more gendered way, which is to say these women are passive victims. They don't really have agency, because women from non-European backgrounds don't really have agencies, so they are at the mercy of their cultures, backward cultures, and of their men. And this is, yes, to say, obviously this is a gendered form of racism, but it's still a very dangerous form of racism.
That's fantastic, thanks. So, I mean, about this, the phenomenon of feminationalism, for example, I don't know why I said for example, it doesn't mean feminine, about that. I mean, it's a historical question, so you might, and it's, I mean, the book doesn't claim it sort of to be a sort of historical, a longitudinal historical study, so it might be unfair, but I wonder what you think about it. Within what time frame does the specific phenomenon you think that you're analysing sort of emerge, and to what extent is it continuous with older sort of colonialist, orientalist, kind of racist sort of ideas and fantasies about the about the sort of the differential attitudes to gender, say within sort of othered communities?
I mean, my research in the book really focuses upon a very contemporary period. So I look at these parties, slogans, political work between 2001 and 2013. So obviously 9/11 has been a very important starting point, because after 9/11, you might remember the bombing of Afghanistan, justified as a way of liberating Muslim women from the burqa and so forth. So that was really the moment in which all these ideas that nationalists were liberating these Muslim women became particularly, if you want, popular. So in that sense, it's a very contemporary focus. I look at these parties only in this period. At the same time, I mean, absolutely, you're right, these ideas, this instrumentalization of women's rights, specifically against non-Western men, is certainly nothing new. It has what I call also in the book, it's colonial legacies. It is a trope that we find during colonialism, in all really type of, at least European colonialisms, really, because you can see that, for instance, during the British Empire was using exactly this trope, this idea of colonized women being inferiorized and victimized as a way also of justifying its colonial enterprise as democratic, as emancipating. Or very famously, the French Empire in its colonies used the so-called civilizing and emancipating processes and mission as a way again of saying these men, these Arab Muslim men, are savages and so forth. So this is just to say this is a recurring trope. And I have to say, in fact, this was one of the most challenging points for me, and in a way it's still a challenge to understand exactly the different articulations between these past legacies, how they are appropriated, but also how they change. So in a way, what I say is that certainly this legacy and this trope, it's still very much present nowadays. It is there. At the same time, I wouldn't claim that there was the same political economic foundation during colonialism that we have now. Also because, of course, the contexts are different. The trope during colonialism was used in the colonies. I mean, obviously also not only in the colonies, but those colonized subjects were still there. Now we are talking. I am talking of a situation in which this trope is used in Europe when these colonized or ex-colonized subjects are now here and here to stay. This was a huge, and is still a huge, headache for all these nationalists that after 40, 50 years of mass immigration to Europe have not really still accepted that these immigrants are here to stay. If you look into all these narratives, it's really incredible to watch this totally lack of acceptance of this phenomenon. But maybe what I didn't exactly explain well earlier is that I think the political economic foundation of feminationalism now, in the very contemporary moment, which is different from the colonial past perhaps, is precisely that if these nationalists can claim that, you know, they can make an exception for women and they actually want to respect women's rights is because these women are hugely needed in European economies nowadays, because also because of what Sara said before, there is a care crisis and there is a huge need for carers, also because lots of non-migrant women are not willing or do not want, for several reasons, to do these caring jobs anymore. And therefore, you know, there is a certain way of these parties and these states, you know, to close an eye to migrant women because they are, in fact, hugely needed in a context of, you know, withdrawal of the state from giving actually care, you know, services and so forth. So I would say that there are continuities, but there is also a specificity of contemporary feminationalism.
Okay, fantastic, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There's clearly, I mean, I remember it was really a shock when the neocons started using, you know, sending, you know, as a pretext for bombing Afghanistan, to say we want to send girls to school. That's why we're bombing. That's why we're doing it, because it wasn't.
But we're bombing
Yeah,
schools.
yeah, that's why. I mean, it was. You know, clearly it was. I mean, like you said, and like I was thinking, you can go back to the 19th century and see them. You know, this idea of a civilising mission. You know, partly involved with the treatment of women, and there being, yeah, having to be sort of enabled to become sort of decent Victorian subjects or something. But it was also, despite that lineage, there was clearly a real break around 2000. I think with the. I mean, it seems to me it's something about the politics of sort of neoconservatism actually that it starts to emerge at that moment. There's still quite, if you think, I mean, just thinking about the American case, it's quite difficult actually to fit the Bush presidency into the kind of narrative of what's happened since the kind of early 90s. I mean, there's quite a neat, in the whole kind of Atlantic Anglosphere, kind of Britain and the United States, there's quite a neat narrative really that from the kind of early 90s, from the moment when Clinton becomes president, there's a fairly consistent sort of almost global kind of hegemonic set of norms, you know, which are the norms of a kind of emerging, you know, powerful class fractions really of, you know, finance capital, Silicon Valley, etc. And it's socially liberal neoliberalism. It's the politics of Bill Clinton, then it's the politics of the third way. And then Bush really does have to negotiate that in some ways. Although, like, the politics of his base and his party are like really right wing, then, you know, they don't really have much success in rolling out a kind of socially conservative agenda at a federal level. There's a lot of rhetoric, and something that emerges at that moment. I think you've really identified in a really important way that some of this, you know, feminationalism seems to partly emerge in that context. They can't. There's a real limit to conservatism. And or little conservatism has to kind of change its terms of reference in that way. And I suppose this is it's partly. No, I'm going to talk about that afterwards. I'm thinking. Well, the thing I'm thinking about partly is I'll get you both to talk about actually is the extent to which, well, to some extent, I mean, it's partly related to the fact that the actual ruling class, I mean, the global capitalist class, in some sense, has undergone a genuine and authentic conversion, or is it the case they've undergone a sort of authentic conversion to some kind of liberal feminism? Like I always think about Rupert Murdoch, for example. I mean, Rupert Murdoch, you know, there's no better agent of the global, no better representative of the capitalist class globally. But he genuinely wanted his daughter to be empowered. You know, he genuinely wanted it. Like, he wanted her to become an executive in the company. He didn't want her just to be a debutante, get married. And so there's some sense in which it is like, is that a factor? Is that part? I know this is a bit off track a little bit. I know it is. But it seems like it's related to feminationalism to the extent that, well, it's partly to do, I suppose what I'm getting at is to do with the ways in which conservatism itself actually has had to sort of address the fact that its own, the class interests, the actual social classes and class fractions that it represents have themselves, in some senses, like, shifted in their kind of priorities. Is that part of it? Is there anything to that?
What do you mean? Sorry, can you just explain a little bit more what you mean this last bit? What classes have shifted?
Well, I'm thinking that historically, conservatism of any kind is linked to, you know, the kind of it has a kind of, to some degree, it has a popular base in certain populations, but it's always allied. It's always, you know, essentially representing the interests, I would say, of particular sections of the ruling class in different contexts. And that I'm wondering to what extent then feminationalism partly has to do with the fact, if at all, that just globally, I think, the kind of capitalist class, like even the relatively reactionary sections of the capitalist class, has changed what it wants, even for its own daughters. Like it has changed, like it has genuinely embraced a certain kind of liberal feminism. That then any kind of conservative politics or militarist politics, to some extent, has to negotiate with. You can just say that's nonsense.
I'm thinking about what you're saying. I don't know. This is a good question. I mean, in a way, it makes me think about what's going on in Europe at the moment, and I think there are different conservative projects, perhaps, in Europe at the moment that's worth looking at, because I come from Italy, and if you look at what's going on in Italy, I don't know if you follow, but we really have fascism on its way back. We have a really like almost explicitly fascist vice prime minister. We have attacks against migrants going on a daily basis, or even not migrants, just everyone who doesn't look white and Italian, whatever that means. And we have this climate of justification of racism in any form, which is really scary. I mean, it's so in that sense, and the other thing I wanted to say also, clearly this is also going hand in hand, hands with a certain renaissance of totally anti-feminist, anti-abortion campaigns. So just a few weeks ago, there was the World Congress of Families in Verona, and it was a huge event in Italy because it was like the most really abhorrent fringes of the humankind, I would say, were present at this event. Just to give you a little example, which really shocked me when I saw that, they're distributing in this conference little fetuses as like, plastic fetuses, and with saying things like, we want to protect it, something like that. But this was like, the little fetus was a little gadget that the conference participants would get so just to give you a little example of what I'm talking about. So this World Congress was taking part, and I think this is also interesting about what Sara was saying about the reaction against popular feminism. So this was also taking place in a context in which there is actually also a very important feminist movement in Italy at the moment. So against the World Congress, there were hundreds of thousands of women who went to Verona, who protested against the Congress, who protested against the presence of the vice prime minister at the Congress, so explicitly endorsing this anti-feminist and anti-abortion agenda. So if you ask me, in Italy, you clearly see how the conservative forces are in a way at the moment so confident of themselves that they are not even claiming to be feminist. They are not even claiming to say, well, actually, yes, we want to defend women's rights. The only instance in which they do that is when it comes to migrants. Then, of course, the migrants are the problem, the migrants are the rapists, and so forth. But look at this country. I mean, look at the UK. I don't see the same thing happening, even though obviously we have a conservative government, one of the worst conservative governments of history, perhaps. Look at austerity, like articles every day saying that the United Kingdom is becoming like the United States in terms of inequality and so forth. But at the same time, I don't see this government really, bothering too much about feminism in a way. I mean, it's not claiming that it wants to abolish abortion rights, for example. It doesn't seem to be high in the agenda at the moment. Obviously, these things shift, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but at the moment, it doesn't seem to be much of their target. So I guess my answer to you, it's very messy, but it's a way of saying, I guess we need to see different conservative projects in different contexts. And certainly, I guess conservatism has probably an instrumental relationship to issues of feminism and women's rights, I guess, as well. I guess it also depends on what it feels is the strategic interest of the moment.
Okay, yeah, that's really, it's not messy, it's a really precise answer. That's really right, I think you're right. I mean, it was obviously, my question was coming from a very sort of Anglo-centric perspective, actually. And even in the States, there's a really aggressive, anti-feminist backlash happening there. Was it, have they passed it in Georgia? They just passed this legislation saying you can't have an abortion if a fetal heartbeat can be detected. Which basically means you can't have an abortion.
I think the more important thing is that if you do have one, you are charged with a criminal act.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah, it's criminal. Yeah, so obviously that is, obviously you're right, there is serious sort of anti-feminist backlash happening. Okay, so you talked already a bit about some of the emergence of kind of far-right politics in Europe, and I think one of the most important strands in the book is your sort of commentary and analysis of the specific forms which contemporary fascism is taking, in places like France and Italy. And one of the chapters is called, why feminine nationalism is no populism? Why it's not populism? So I'd be really interested if you could talk us through that argument a bit, because populism, I'm really pleased to see anyone say anything isn't populism. Like I'm supposed to say, I'm supposed to do. I'm very late with an article for the New Statesman about why, 9 times out of 10, when people use the word populism, they shouldn't use it. So, can you tell us some more about that?
I guess the same reason a little bit, because everything seems to be populism now. So I think I was a little bit reacting also against that. I think when I say feminationalism is not populism, I'm trying to say that, some people, scholars, journalists, have tried to present this new endorsement of feminism by these nationalist parties by saying, they're modernizing. They are not really, the old fascist right-wing stuff of 20, 30 years ago. Now they're modern, populist parties, and therefore they also endorse women's rights. So, the populist label, in the case of these right-wing parties, was used as a way of saying these parties are new and they are doing new things, and they're also more open to civil rights, etc. So I think, what these analyses really miss is that, first, this really label of populism, left and right, doesn't make sense anymore. But secondly, I think they miss that the reason why these parties are mobilizing the ideas of women's rights is absolutely not new. It is, in fact, very old, and as I said earlier about the colonial legacies. And it has to do with the fact that these parties are fundamentally nationalists. And the nationalist parties, the nationalist project by itself needs women. It needs to claim that it defends women, but also nationalism as a project is centered around women, not women as, the protagonists in a positive way, but women as, the bodies that need to be controlled, because women are fundamentally the biological and cultural reproducers of the nation. And therefore, of course, nationalists want to claim that they protect women. What they want to protect, however, is not women, but they want to protect the idea that women are going to be controlled, that they are not going to mix up with non-white or non-Western or non-national men, and therefore that they are going to, stay within the hierarchical gender order according to which, at the end of the day, women really must keep their place, must know what their place is, the traditional place at home, as wives, and so forth. That's why, parties like Marine Le Pen in France, on the one hand, she's a woman, and so she claims to be now, to want to be empowering women and defending women, and especially defending, the Muslim young women, and so forth. At the same time, she's in favor of pro-natalist fertility policies, and she puts forward policies such as, of course, French families should have tax releases, tax benefits if they have more than 3 kids, for example. And the whole point, though, is they have to be French nationals. Of course, this does not apply to non-French. So I guess, in short, I think populism doesn't help us very much to understand what's going on with these parties. And also, one very last thing I want to say is that it doesn't help us very much, because usually populism is presented as the dichotomy us versus them. So the us is always the people, and the them could be, them, the political elite, the political system, or the immigrants. So in this sense, it's this dichotomic logic that is at the heart of populism. But I think this dichotomic logic doesn't explain why the people are against the immigrants, for example, but within the immigrants are a little bit in favor of the migrant women, of the immigrant women, because they are actually, a little bit useful to our elderly people, children, and so forth. So I thought this complicates this very, binary dichotomic reasoning, and I thought that actually what helps to explain it is not so much populism, but nationalism.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. It's a really important work in the book is to sort of, revivify the use of nationalism as an analytical category. Because, I think you make a really good argument that there's several things wrong with the use of the term populism in a lot of contemporary sort of academic and journalistic discourse. But in very simple terms, it's a revival of a really old liberal position, which just basically thinks any kind of mass democratic politics is the same and tends towards authoritarianism. And so you talk about left populism and right populism, and you're talking about political formations which have very little in common apart from the fact they're not technocratic neoliberal centrism. And so I think understanding the specificity of nationalism, as you argue, I think is really important. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before reading it. I think following up just what you were just talking about, to what extent is to what extent do you think the kind of popular base for that, especially amongst women, actually? I'm thinking about formations like it's not called the Front National anymore, is it? It's got a new, what's it called? What's its new name? I can't remember. It's rebranded. Yeah, they changed the name like last year, literally. They've rebranded the French National Front. So the Le Penist organisation, but. It's really bugging me now. I'll look it up later. I'll look it up before we finish. Are they? To what extent is their base, or rather, I should say, well, there's a certain sort of standard line about the rise of the Front National, which you get from kind of French journalists, you get from that book Returning to Rheims, you get from a kind of popular, and that's that. Their base is in the working class, and their base is amongst people who haven't really been able to benefit from the various cultural and social shifts of the past few decades. So particularly amongst women, there's a constituency for whom sort of neoliberal feminism actually doesn't really offer anything, because they don't have the they don't have the qualifications, they don't have the access to the labour market, they never did, and so that's why they are easily sort of interpolated by a natalist politics. Is that accurate? Is it too simplistic? Is it? Well, the women, the argument that would be that one of the reasons why a kind of conservative, anti-feminist, pro-natalist politics is popular with a certain constituency, especially of women, is that they're precisely people who don't have the kind of educational, the kind of cultural capital, or the resources to sort of participate as empowered neoliberal feminist subjects. I'm not putting that forward as my account. I'm saying that's a fairly, that's a kind of argument one comes across. Is that accurate, or is it too simple?
Well, I guess so. You're saying that you think also these parties are popular with a certain sector of women. Well, this is really controversial. I'm asked this question often, and I'm always puzzled in a way by the answer, because again, I guess, it is certainly true that female vote, which is how, in the end measure this kind of phenomena, female vote has grown for these parties, for sure, because it used to be quite tiny, because they were, traditionally, they are anti-feminist parties, but they were more vocal about their anti-feminism in the past, I would say. So certainly, the fact that they are, as they claim, modernizing, the fact that some of their leaders are women, as in the case of Marine Le Pen, or even as in the case of the women leaders in AfD in Germany, for example, this is certainly probably more attractive for women. I guess there is a whole fringe sector of conservative women, as there has always been, perhaps, which is also attracted to these parties. In a way, because I guess these parties represent these security, in a way, of these old hierarchical, safe kind of social order and gender order in which many women invest and identify. So I guess also, the whole of society in a way is going more right-wing, and the left, especially, the center-left, if we can call it that way, is usually responsible for that, because it's been, in my view, conceding too much to right-wing arguments over the last 20 years, especially when it comes to immigrants. I think it's absolutely astonishing that the left has been, really imitating and following the right on anti-immigration, thinking that these would be more popular, amongst the popular classes, without realizing that when you imitate the right wing, you're just going to, make society even more right wing. And when they become more right wing, they are not going to vote for you. So I think it's also a more, I would say, general trend to which also women participate.
Okay, great, thanks. So I suppose it's an obvious question, but what do you think is the best sort of political response to make to the rise of feminationalism? Like, what is it? What is to be done?
We'll get around to that eventually.
Well, I think the most, it's a little bit following on what I said earlier. So I think the most effective way really is, first of all, I think it's important to, listen to the voices of Muslim, migrant, and all these women, racialized women who are, the target, but also the victims in many ways of these feminational discourses, because this is also something sometimes I'm criticized about, but you don't take into account the voices of these women. And to a certain extent it is true, but my justification is also that there is only so much you can write in a book, and the other thing is that I limit myself to an analysis. But I think it is also true. I think I'm a bit touched by this criticism, because I think it is true that it is very important, to give voice and to listen to what these women have to say about what they think emancipation should be, and how they, I believe in self-emancipation. I don't think that there should be state laws telling people how to dress or what to do, etc. So I think it's important to, that these women really find their own ways for self-determination and self-emancipation. So I think, first, this is very important. The second way of fighting feminationalism certainly is to fight racism at any possible opportunity and in any possible way. And this means also, in my view, because this is very contemporary now all across Europe, really to support open borders. I hear far too much, even on the left and even in the Labour Party in this country, for instance, people talking about the necessity to close borders, maybe for a little while, as I think Paul Mason was suggesting like last year or months ago, or maybe, just because we need to take into account Brexit voters, Leave voters, Labour Leave voters. I think it's so incredibly wrong, because well, precisely because we have to be very true to the principle of anti-racism and of open borders and not fall into these, racist or anti-immigration propaganda. And I think also it's important because lots of people make this into an economic argument. These migrants are taking native people's jobs. This is absolutely not true. What all studies demonstrate is that actually migrants do not take native people's jobs. Because what happens, in fact, is that migrants tend to the majority of them at least, tend to do the, so-called low skills, low pay jobs at the very bottom of the labor market, of the scale of the labor market. And that means that if there is any competition at the bottom, that is between migrants themselves. All actually studies demonstrate this, that there is no really effect, there is no way in which migrants are really affecting wages, also for reasons related to, the fact that there are trade unions that, still negotiate wages, so we are not in the far west of wages like in the United States, for example, in many respects. So I think it is incredibly important to make the argument, the left-wing argument of open borders, for instance, as an argument against racism, as an argument against any type of instrumentalization of also women's rights, by these nationalist and conservative forces.
Okay, that's really useful. Thanks. That's really very persuasive. I suppose, actually, while you were talking, I thought about one more question I wanted to try to tease out a little bit more, which is to do with the relationship between what Sara was talking about and feminationalism. Because with feminationalism, you're identifying quite a specific formation, I think, which is the way in which there's kind of right-wing parties and a kind of conservative and various kinds of conservatism and are actually using a kind of language of feminism in certain cases, or a kind of pseudo-feminism. And then Sara is more talking about the way in which there's a kind of, at least, probably across Europe, across the United States, a sort of hegemonic kind of neoliberal kind of feminism, sort of popular feminism as a kind of common sense. And a lot of, to some extent, these kind of right-wing parties are, as I understand it, you can tell me if I'm wrong, they're sort of in opposition to some extent. They're from the right to a kind of mainstream sort of liberalism, or are they? I suppose this was what I'm trying to work out actually, is what is the relationship of sort of feminationalism to neoliberal feminism, and really to neoliberal culture generally?
Well, I guess one of the reasons why these nationalist right-wing parties, they can claim now feminist ideas is also because, as Sara says, feminism is popular. And, this kind of vague idea of feminism as empowerment and so forth. So I think they do realize that there is a certain climate in which, feminism is popular. At the same time, they are the forces, the reactive forces of popular misogyny. And I guess, again, it depends on the context, and they are caught in a kind of, dilemma here. Because, and I think the way they have resolved it is by saying, yes, we are feminist, even though they might not use the term, but we want to defend women's rights because we are against migrant men and Muslim men, because they are the real enemies of women's rights. But we are feminists also because we want to protect our national women. But then, obviously, when you look at what they do they claim this is totally anti-feminist, is against abortion, women's reproductive rights, and so forth. So I guess, yes, I think this, there are lots of complexities and contradictions in this. More generally, I guess there is also more interesting, not more interesting, but I guess a more complex, in fact, relationship between feminationalism and neoliberalism, or neoliberal feminism, in the sense that, in this book I also look at the ways in which neoliberals themselves, and more specifically neoliberal policies, are used in the way of claiming, that Muslim women need to be emancipated. And so I look specifically at workfare policies and the ways in which Muslim and migrant women are increasingly pushed to take jobs, nannies, social reproductive jobs, telling them, yeah, of course you should take these jobs, even though they are not great jobs, because in this way you will be emancipating yourself, you will become economically independent, and so forth. But this is just a classical neoliberal workfare, because what they do is that if you don't take those jobs, we are going to cut your social benefits. So there is obviously, it's a blackmailing going on, which is classically neoliberal in that sense. But I think there is also another way in which there is a link between femonationalism and neoliberal feminism, which is related to the fact that they are both, in a way, representing white middle-class women's projects. And by doing that, as also, for instance, Katrin Rothenberg, who is here, says very well in her book on neoliberal feminism, by doing that and representing this section of women, they are in fact silencing the majority of women, those women who are, cleaning the houses of the white middle-class women, so the white middle-class women can go to the office and lean in and feel empowered. And also, there is a way in which this link can be seen in the fact that all these white middle-class women want to break the glass ceiling, but at the end of the day, the majority of women are actually busy cleaning the floors under that ceiling, both metaphorically and literally. So I guess what I find interesting is also all these links. I think these are important links between these two projects.
Well, thanks very much. That's brilliant. Okay, I'm going to let you pause for a minute now. So everybody, give Sara a clap. We're going to take. So we've been doing this past couple of weeks. So we're going to have a 5-minute break so people can go to get a drink, go to the toilet, and then we'll come back and have questions, discussion. Okay.
Do you want anything here? Did I finish my one?
Cigaro per sé? Io.
Very good pair, honey.
It's up there, it looks like it's full. That's why I was like,
Hey. You were a little tired. Hey. You're fine. Yeah, I'm just a little tired. That's good. Yes, I do. I know all of you. Where is my love? I'm going to...
was it?
No, it's definitely my love. Oh, are you thinking wine? Yeah. Oh, come on. Oh, yes, a little bit. Yes, but let me get a little bit of water because I'm really thirsty. Yes, Denise.
So fabulous on your feet. Really fabulous, isn't it, Grace?
Who was just saying, is that your metaphor? Like glass ceiling in the floor? It's not really. No, it's not. But, like, maybe that was.
Isn't she fabulous?
She's so
Listen, I have to say this guy is not the brightest person. And you just run rings around these idiotic comments.
Do you want to meet Sara Banet too?
In later.
Okay.
You have to buy it.
It was really cool. I mean, in a way, I agree. We had asked the same question to both. Doing,
It's a weird.
Yeah, the
You have to go back up. It's not 5 minutes yet.
I was just
Denise Riley, you need to meet Sara Banet. Sara, this is Denise Riley. Yeah. Are you staying?
How they speak to each other in particular ways, and yes, it was. Oh, I think we're ready to go back there.
No, I just
I'm very happy. Because I mean, I love brilliant women. Have probably noticed.
Years ago, my friend was a friend to feel
where American presidents' wives there to see their daughters. It's a sort of school picture.
Yeah, I think he had some, I always remember he had this great, I've used this example all the time. He talked about the common sense and good sense, and he used the malicious sense, which was, I think, like an example of good sense. They're not wrong that someone is out to get them, they're not wrong. The state is out in their interest.
I'll actually
You know, I went to the launch of that. I went to a talk about that.
You and
Lynn, it's him and Lynn.
busy with
She didn't know who I was. And like it was only like
world famous. I never tell you.
like a European in Sheffield on this Saturday, not in London. No, I was staying for the last one in London. I have no more. We might have to rent some. Would you be willing?
No, she doesn't. How far is Sheffield? What time is it? I come back in 5. And now you tell me. Is that why? Because it's also about my You're hopeless. But I'm dying.
Are you going
to come on the 28th to Alton Winch? Did I not send you the invitation? And then, but only if it's reciprocated. I'm not either, but only if it's reciprocated. I'm dying to see you doing fucking poetry. And you.
There's a funny tiny minor scandal. We're very much against my view, but with my consent, because I thought that after 200 years they would have a women's group and agreed to be nominated for the and they said, the administrator saying, no, there is a page anybody at the age of 69 because I'd done the decent thing by saying, yes, just in order to have more than one woman in the Senate, I would stand in
and you should do ageism, and you should not.
Ageism it's been in the press, in the conservative press. It's all over Twitter. I know.
But you
my name.
I'm going to now.
The whole
Remember that you're a troublemaker in a very, very Denise way.
I just keep looking. I'm so shocked about it. Don't
somebody who, a good friend and neighbor, got it, and she deserves it. So it wasn't leading. It was wonderful. I'm just wrong. There was anyway.
I think it is.
You're going back away.
Okay. Right, we're going to start. Joe, my partner, says they're watching at home actually on the live stream. So if everybody could wave, so everybody say hello. Hi, Joe.